Hey guys, welcome back. Today I am finally transplanting my onions into the garden. And if you're starting onions for the first time this year from seed, then this is a video for you. Today I'm going to be sharing my tried and true tips on how to grow the biggest bulbs this season. But before we get started, if you're new here, hi guys, my name is Marsha the Blackthumbgardener and I live in Ontario, Canada, Zone 5B, and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, I'd love for you to subscribe, and if you're returning, welcome back, and thank you so much for supporting my channel. Now let's get started. So there are two onion varieties that I'm growing today and I'm excited to share them with you. Now I started these seeds back in January, and if you're a northern gardener like me, then you want to get your seeds started in January and transplanted into the garden in early spring. Now if you're a southern gardener, you're already harvesting your onions because you would have started them back in the fall. So the first variety I started from seed is my favorite, and that's the Walla Walla onion. This is a beautiful sweet onion. It's my favorite to grow in the garden each year. And the Walla Walla onion is what's considered a long day onion. So what that means is it takes about 14 to 16 hours of daylight that's needed in order to form bulbs. If you're a northern gardener, you definitely want to be growing varieties that are from the long day category. So I've mentioned on this channel a few times that I have a sister who lives in Florida and she's always asking me for seeds. And not that I don't want to send her seeds, but the challenge is she lives in the south and I live in the north. And especially when she's asking me for onion seeds, I'm always saying, I would love to send them, sis, but my seeds will not work for your area. I tend to grow a lot of long day onions and they're intended for people who live in colder climates. You're in the south, you should be growing short day onion varieties. And short day onion varieties only need 10 to 12 hours of daylight. They're typically grown in the fall, winter, and harvested in the spring. So the reason why, if you're in the south, you're starting them in the fall, winter, and harvesting them in the spring is because onions don't like extreme heat. But there is an in-between, and the next variety I have is Cabernet. This is a beautiful red onion. This is my first year trying out Cabernet, but the fun fact about Cabernet is that this variety is what's called an intermediate or day neutral onion, which means it needs only about 12 to 14 hours of daylight in order for the bulbs to form. Okay guys, let's go transplant our onions. We're going to be planting onions in the back of these two raised beds, and then I think I might plant some onions along the edge of the middle raised bed, the one with the cover on it right now. And that's because I intend on growing tomatoes in that bed. The leafy greens are just kind of a cover crop until I can bring my warm season crops out. And I like planting onions with tomatoes because they're a great pest deterrent. So I think I'm going to do that as well. This back raised bed here, it has peas, and I'm definitely not going to be planting my onions in this bed because onions are not a great companion plant with peas. Planting onions with peas will actually stunt the growth of the peas, so we definitely don't want to do that. Now, before you plant a single onion in your raised bed or in ground or wherever you're going to be planting, I highly recommend you do a soil test beforehand. Now, ideally, you should be doing a soil test in the fall, but I didn't have any time or energy in the fall to do that. So I did that this past spring, and the results were very interesting. And if you want to see my soil test results, I do have a video about that, so I'll link it below. But there were two outcomes of that soil test. Number one, my pH was extremely high, which meant that I had two raised beds in my garden that were very alkaline. And with onions, they prefer a slightly acidic pH, like a 5.5 to 6.5. So I think knowing what your pH is before you start growing is extremely important depending on the type of plants that you intend to grow in that space. Now, I did end up amending both of these raised beds. I ended up putting elemental sulfur in the beds to help reduce the pH over time. The other outcome of my soil test was that I had low nitrogen or depleted nitrogen in all of my raised beds, which is kind of expected after a growing season. So before I get started, there were a couple of things I did in the last video to help the process. Number one, I added compost to all of my raised beds. Number two, I added worm castings. But right now, before we plant, I'm going to add some blood meal. Now, blood meal is basically 1200 when it comes to NPK, which means it's all nitrogen. Now, normally I would be using this product, ProMix. It's a organic tomato, vegetable, and fruit garden fertilizer. When I plant, I tend to use ProMix as a granular fertilizer in each of the holes that I'm putting my plants in. But the problem is that this is a 448 in terms of NPK. And I already have a lot of phosphorus and potassium in all of my raised beds. That's what the test results showed. And the issue is really nitrogen versus anything else. So rather than me add this organic fertilizer, I'm just gonna fill the beds with blood meal because that's what I'm really missing. It's the nitrogen. So the two raised beds that I'm planting in are pretty identical. They both have peppers, spinach, carrots, and beets in them. And then I'm going to be adding a tomato along the trellis to connect to the other side. And in each of these beds, I'm going to be putting one variety of onion. So in this bed, I'm going to be having sweet peppers. So I'm going to be putting the Walla Wallas with my sweet peppers. And then in the other bed, I have hot peppers. So I'm going to be putting the Cabernet red onions in the hot pepper bed. Now, what I love about growing onions is that you don't need a lot of space to grow them. You can just use one container, and that's what I've done. I started all of my seeds in this, I think this is a 3.3-inch Bootstrap Farmer container, and onions are okay grown together. And then when you separate them, it's pretty easy. This is what the roots look like. And then what I do is I just gently try to remove the soil, and they're pretty easy to pull apart. Oops, there we go. Let's see. See, look at that. Very, very easy to pull apart. So again, you don't need a ton of containers. You don't need a lot of space. I've grown onions in solo cups and it's worked perfectly fine. Onions are pretty flexible that way. So I have one. Ideally, you want to plant your onions about 3 to 6 inches apart. That's just so the bulb has space to grow as big as possible. And because I have such a small space, a small backyard garden, this bed is not very big. I tend to plant my onions a little bit closer together. If I end up with a smaller size bulb, I'm perfectly fine with that because I'm looking for volume in terms of the number of onions that I get out of the garden versus how big they are. But if you want to grow really big onions, then you definitely need to give them more room. So in this bed right now, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 6 onions that I'm planting in this bed. Technically, 4, maybe even 3 would be ideal in this raised bed. And if you want to know how big this raised bed is, I think it's like a 2x4 raised bed in terms of, width is 4 feet across. So definitely I would give it more space, but I'm not going to do that today. When it comes to planting onions, the key to growing really big bulbs is not to plant them too deep. You want to make sure you get the roots in, of course, but you don't want to go too deep. Otherwise, you're going to be having your bulbs forming in the soil. And what you ideally want is your bulbs to be forming on the soil, on top. If you have your bulbs forming in the soil and you have heavy compacted soil, what's going to happen is that it's going to be really hard for your bulbs to break through that soil and form really big bulbs. So you want to ideally plant this about 1 inch to 2 inches. Ideally, I like 1 to 1.5 inches deep, and that way you have your bulbs forming on top of the soil. I just like to make one straight line across. I lay down all of my onions first, and then I just go in and plant. Okay guys, we're on the other side and we're going to be planting the Cabernet onions, and this is where all of my hot peppers will be. So in the other bed, I planted 6 Walla Walla onions. So I'm going to be planting 6 Cabernet onions here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'm just going to lay it out first. Make sure I have the spacing right. Now, if your soil pH is perfectly fine and you have NPK, your NPK scores are balanced, then you can totally use a granular fertilizer. Onions are heavy feeders, so I highly recommend putting something in the soil while you're transplanting. It could be compost, it could be worm castings, it could be a granular fertilizer, just something to help get them going. Okay, now I need to plant the middle bed, and I really want the onions on this side, but I have a lot of my winter sowing here. So I'm gonna try and do this around my winter sowing. I'm gonna start off with Walla Walla. I have 1 Walla Walla left over. So I guess I'm just planting Walla Walla in this bed. So this is what the row of Walla Wallas look like on the side of the raised bed. Now for the rest of these, I do have one more location that I'm considering. So what I might do is just plant that up later on, but I do have a little bit of a pile left over. And I also have 2 more containers, one with Walla Walla and Cabernet. Those are for friends. So I'm gonna try and plant everything else that's left here, and then I'll reserve the last 2 for giveaways. So now it's time to talk about watering. And when it comes to watering, you definitely need to have consistent water when you're growing onions. Ideally, you want to water in the morning so that the top of the plant has time to dry out before the sun really hits. And you want to water deeply. And that's something I don't do really well at. I like to go around the garden quickly. When I was hand watering, now I have irrigation, so I don't have to worry about it as much. But you do need to stay on top of watering because the bulbs need a lot of water to form. Actually, there's a lot of water in onions, if you didn't know, so you really need to have sufficient watering when you're growing onions. And once the bulbs start to form and the top of the leaves start to brown, that's when you can totally pull back on watering so that the onion has time to cure. And while it's curing, it needs a dry environment. So if you do get to the point where you're harvesting onions, you should really pull back on a lot of your watering. It's hard for me to do that because I'm actively growing other things in the same raised bed. So I tend to pull my onions a little bit earlier and then cure them in my basement. So let's get watering. So while I spent this entire time talking about growing onions from seed and the different classes of onions that you can grow depending on where you live, I haven't talked about if you haven't started onions from seed, what do you do? So the first thing I would do is go to my garden center and buy a transplant because onion transplants are so cheap at the garden center. You can get them, I'm in Canada, so you can get them for as low as $2 if you go to a local nursery. And you can get some very interesting varieties. Now you are limited to what that nursery decides to grow in that season, but I've seen some pretty interesting onion varieties over the years, and I will buy transplants and add them to my garden. Nothing wrong with that. So if you haven't started your onions from seed, that's a great way to get started. The second way is that you can buy them bare roots online. So this gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of variety because there's more options available, which is basically a dehydrated, you're basically getting an onion like this It's just dehydrated, and then you rehydrate it by putting it in water for about half an hour, and then you plant it into the garden like we're doing now. So that's a great way to start onions. So the last way that you can get onions into the garden, if you haven't started them from seed, is that you can buy sets. And what a set is, it's basically a baby onion. So it's an onion that has been grown the prior year. It's taken out of the ground, and then basically all you're getting is the little bulb, and then you can plant that bulb into the garden and you can grow your full-size onion. And because it's the second year, the growth will speed up and you'll get a beautiful bulbing onion. The only issue I have with buying onion sets is that they come in very limited varieties. You're basically getting whatever yellow or white onion and then basically a red onion variety. It's not like when you're buying transplants or a bare root or you're growing them yourselves. You're not getting a lot of variety. But if you just want a basic red or yellow onion or white onion, then maybe going and buying sets may be better for you. For me personally, I prefer growing them from seed. I like to control the process from beginning to end. And I also like to select what I'm growing. And I find with growing onions from seed, you just get a lot of variety. You can choose, there's so many options, so many different types of onions and varieties that you can buy from seed. And it's very cost effective because, an onion seed packet can be about $3, and there are hundreds of seeds in one seed packet. You could even save your own seeds when you're growing in that year and then use those seeds for your next season. There are so many ways to start onions, so don't let not starting your onions from seeds stop you from growing them in the garden this season. So before we wrap up, I want to talk about fertilizer because I get asked about how or when I fertilize my seedlings or my plants all the time. So while these guys are growing right now, I'll hit them with a liquid fertilizer about every 2 weeks. I feel like they don't really need a lot right now because I've just amended the bed with nitrogen. I have compost. I put fresh potting mix at the top layer. I have worm castings on them, so they have enough to grow for the next little bit. As they're actively growing in the early summer months, I'll start hitting them with fertilizer every week. And that is also because I'll have other plants in the garden as well that's taking up a lot of the nutrients from the soil. So I'll have tomatoes, I'll have other crops, peppers. So I tend to increase the amount of fertilizer I'm using. And one last thing is that if you're in the north, onions are pretty frost tolerant. Now they can handle a light frost, let's say -4, -5 degrees Celsius. They'll bounce back really quickly. But if it gets to like -10 degrees Celsius, then I would definitely consider covering them up. For the past maybe, I want to say 6 years, I've always planted my onions this time of year. Although this year, the temperatures are lower than historical averages. So I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on the weather to make sure that the temperatures aren't dipping too low. So just wanted to add that in before we go. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.